Started with 56 last week, and we're going to continue on with that. We're going to kind of move a little bit quicker. We'd gotten for the most part of chapter 56, and we're talking in the first part of it. We're talking about salvation for the Gentiles, which tells us that Isaiah is a messianic prophet. He talks about the coming of the Christ, because you can't talk about salvation for the Gentiles unless you talk about the Christ, because that was the only way salvation could come to the Gentiles, right? Unless you had a Redeemer, unless you had a Messiah, salvation could not come. So here it is. He is speaking of the salvation for the Gentiles, that they could come to God. They can have a relationship that previously was reserved only for the Jews, and now here the Gentiles are going to be added to this covenant of promise. All right. So we've gotten all the way through verse 9, and so we're going to read just a little bit about the in the last part of 56, and then we're going to get into 57. In this part, the heading of mine, of course, says Israel's irresponsible leaders. Well, if we remember what we've been reading about the divided kingdom, Isaiah is prophesying during this time, and it is very much a period of irresponsible leadership. These men who have rejected God and are ignoring God's role in their lives and the roles of the life of their nation, and they're looking to foreign entanglements. They're looking to treaties and joining themselves alliances with other nations, looking to these people to save them when the Assyrians and then, of course, the Babylonians begin to come in and make inroads into the nation. They're still looking at everything else other than God, who should have been at the very first and the foremost of their thoughts and ideas. You look at Hezekiah. Remember when the people were pressing around, he was wondering, inquire of the Lord. Well, these men weren't even asking anything of God. They weren't finding out what is God's desire. It's what should we do? So they lean on their own understanding. There's the reason that we're told not to lean on our own understanding, because what they decided to do was certainly not what God wanted them to do. He told them at the very beginning, don't involve yourself in the nations that surround. Don't make treaties with them. Don't make alliances with them. Don't do anything. I'll take care of you. And we see where their leadership had basically abandoned the idea of allowing God to reign over the nation. And this is what's happened. All right. So Isaiah continues to go on through 56, and he talks about the leadership and how they make themselves out to be greater than they are, and how they make all of these overtures towards leading the nation, but at the end of the day, the one who is supposed to be leading their nation, they have abandoned. And not only themselves, but they've encouraged the people to abandon. These men were not, these men who ostensibly had control over Judah, they weren't practicing idolatry in secret. This was open. It was something that they were promoting by their very actions. They were being very open about what they were doing, and it went up as an affront before God. God was not pleased with it, and He did not accept it, and He did not accept when they would worship Him alongside of their other gods. He did not accept their worship. If we were practicing in here and we did everything we were supposed to do, but then we added something that was not supposed to be added, God doesn't accept our worship. He's not the kind that takes everything and then sifts out the bad and accepts the good. He takes it as a whole. And when it's not good, it's not good. And there's what's happening with the people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. God accepts worship as a whole, not as individual portions. We can't come and leave off one thing and go away from this place thinking that we've worshiped acceptably. It just doesn't work that way. And it is unfortunate, because there are those who believe that you can, that will do everything but this, and God will be happy with it. And He's not. If God had not given us a pattern, then we would have reason to be expected to be excused, but we're not. He's given us a pattern, and that's what we're supposed to have. And He had given the people a pattern. You know, it's kind of telling that when Josiah finds this book of the law, he says he tore his clothes. He was heartbroken because he realized that they had left things undone that they were supposed to be doing. So the entire time that they've been worshiping God, God's not been accepting their worship because it wasn't in accordance with what he had in the law. You can't go by the law if you don't have the law. You can't say, well, we've been doing it right. Well, how could you? Because you didn't have the book of the law that you're supposed to be reading from, with all of the things that go along with it. All right, 57. This is talking about the idolatry of Israel, which is a primary theme of Isaiah, is the idea of idolatry, idolatry, idolatry. This is the problem that they were having in the first place. All of the other things, I mean, there were many other things that Judah was messing up with, but idolatry was the first and foremost. If you can't worship God acceptably, how can you do everything else acceptably? You know, you can't. You can't. All right. So, starting in verse 50, or starting in chapter 57, we're going to read a little bit through it. It says, "The righteous perishes, and no man takes it to heart. Merciful men are taken away, while no one considers that the righteous is taken away from evil. He shall enter into peace. They shall rest in their beds, each one walking in his uprightness. But come here, you sons of the sorceress, you offspring of the adulterer and the harlot." Now, who is he speaking of here? Idolatrous, huh? Okay. Idolatrous Judah. These are those who have, he says, the offspring of the adulterer and the harlot. There's a reason that he uses those words. God viewed it as adultery. There's a reason that even as far back as the days of Moses, that adultery was considered the first and foremost reason for putting aside a marriage. There's a relationship there between a husband and wife that's so unique that God uses it to describe the relationship between himself and his people, Christ and the church. That relationship is so not just the camaraderie between a husband and wife, but the relationship that they enter into when they become husband and wife is so peculiar, and it's even declared to be a mystery. It's a mystery. Why did God choose that relationship? Why didn't God say, well, you can be with whomever you wish? As long as you're, now the world will tell you that, as long as there's two consenting adults, then you can do whatever you want to. Well, God said no. No, it's one man and one woman for life, and there's no getting around that. I said even in days past, he winked at those things. In other words, he allowed it to go on, but it was never his desire for it to be like that. And Christ had to come in and set things straight. He says, no, I'm telling you, because he has the power to do so, that unless the divorce is for adultery only, it's not acceptable. Because when you do that, and that one woman or man goes to another person, it's adultery, and it's a very unique thing, and God views it as that. He views it as spiritual adultery. It's not to be done. It's a sin and an affront before God. So he talks about this idea of the offspring of the adulterer and the harlot. The idea here is that when it talks about they are offspring, it's the nation of Judah has gone into adultery, and these are the offspring of it. These are the people of the nation that has gone into adultery. It says, "Whom do you ridicule? Against whom do you make a wide mouth and stick out the tongue?" And I thought that was kind of funny. It shows that it's basically acting like a child. They're making these facial gestures that are you would expect from a child. You would take a child, they'll pull their mouth out, and they'll stick out their tongue and they'll wag their tongue. You think how childish is this? But that's what he's getting. That's the point he's getting across. Who do you think that you can ridicule? Look at who you are and look at what you're doing. And you're going to stick out your tongue at someone else. Remember, they still consider themselves to be children of God. We worship God. We're sons of God. And here they are involving themselves in this spiritual adultery and mocking the nations that surround it. And he says, these nations are the ones that are going to judge you. They're going to be the ones that are going to act as my power. They're going to come in and drive you out. And you're going to sit there and mock them and ridicule them. You have no standing. You have no reason to talk. All right? They relied on a long-established relationship. But remember, what was Abraham called? Abraham was called a friend of God. Yeah, he was called, and he said, he made him a friend. He was a friend. He said he was God's friend. These people weren't God's friends. To be a friend means you treat them well, right? Have you ever been a part of a relationship where it's one person doing all the nice treating and the other one is just sort of can be very harsh or mean or rude, and you wonder, what kind of relationship is this when I'm the one doing all the hard work? I haven't had that kind of a problem, but I've been in one where I realized that I'm the only one that considers the friendship of any value, and eventually you say, I'm going to let it go, and if I do, it's not going to matter anyway. They're not going to consider it anyway. Well, this is the problem with Judah and God. He's the one doing all the hard lifting. He's the one doing all the heavy lifting. He's the one doing all the hard work. He's the only one making any attempt at managing this relationship, because the people have not. They've abandoned him. Now they would tell you that, oh, no. If you confronted them, they would say, oh, no, we're children, we are sons of God. Jehovah is still our king, but they weren't acting it. And that's how you have to view it. That's how you judge that. But look, he continues on. He said, "Are you not children of transgression?" Now, we got to be careful that we don't look at this idea of being born into sin. There's a real push to make this mean that, and that's not what it means. The idea of children of transgression, but it does mean what? That Judah was involved in spiritual adultery, and these were the offspring of these were the Israelites at this time. That's all it means. The idea of children of transgression, offspring of falsehood, inflaming yourselves with gods under every green tree. Now we go back to this. What is it talking about here? We read about this in the book of Kings and Chronicles, right? The groves and the high places. That's what this means. When they would find these areas of standing trees, they would erect a shrine, and they would worship there. Now, they would say that they were worshiping God, but that's not where God told them to worship, so were they worshiping God there? No. But they said they were. But here it says, inflaming yourselves with gods under every green tree, slaying the children in the valleys. Who are the children? Ones who are faithful, ones who are confronting them in their error, in their sin. Many times it was the priests. The priests of God are still telling the children of Israel, don't do these things, do this instead, worship God, do all of this. And when you had these wicked kings, remember who was killing the wicked kings? Who all was killing? Manasseh, remember? Streets ran red with blood. He was killing these innocent priests, the ones that were trying to keep Israel on the straight and narrow. He was having them slaughtered. So here he talks about this, and all of this is in the pursuit of false gods. Every bit of it is in the pursuit of false gods. Under the clefts of the rocks, among the smooth stones of the stream is your portion. They are your lot. Even to them you have poured a drink offering. You have offered a grain offering. Should I receive comfort in these? Well, they weren't done in the right way. So is God going to receive those as worship? No. I'm going to reject those. Worship must be done in the proper fashion, in the proper way, and in the proper place for the children of Israel. And that's not what they were doing. Okay? Even though they said they were. Even though they said they were worshiping God. You're pouring out your drink offerings in the wrong place. You're putting out your grain offerings in the wrong place. In Jerusalem, in the temple is where these things are supposed to go, not under some stand of trees out in the middle of the desert. That's not where you do. Okay? So anyway, all of 57 talks about this. Every bit of this talks about the idolatry of Judah and the consequences thereof. The fact that God rejects it. God rejects it. Because if it's not offered him in the right way, in the right place, to him it's the same as offering it up to idols. And he will not regard it, which is a lesson to us today. We can worship, we can say we're worshiping, we can do what we want to do, but unless we're doing what we're supposed to be doing, God rejects our worship. And I think about how many people today are going to be going into these places and they're going to be doing everything they think is right. They're going to be singing all of these songs, they're going to be doing all of this stuff, and they're going to go walk away from this place saying, we've worshiped God. But God's looking at it and saying, that's not what I told you to do. I didn't ask for this. But we did this. He said, that's not what I asked for. I think about the idea of around Christmas time. You ever watch a kid and they're opening up a gift, and sometimes they'll open up that gift and they'll be so excited, and they open up that gift, and their face just kind of falls because, man, that is not what I asked for. You know, this is a package of underwear. I didn't want underwear. What's good? I don't want this. I don't want this package of socks. I don't want this whatever. You know, they don't want this practical gift. They just get kind of crestfallen. You know, God, I believe, is a little bit like that because he sees this, and then when he opens up figuratively opens up this package of worship, it's not what he asked for. He's disappointed, and he rejects it. Now, we tell our kids, you act like you're excited. You say thank you, you smile, you say thank you for what you received, and that's all. God doesn't do that. God tells you, this is not what I asked for. I don't want this. And he rejects it. Yep. Pretty much. That's it. All right, so anyway, he continues on through 57. We're not going to read all of this because there's 57 is one thing, a long chapter. But let's look at, go to a little bit further on, go to 14, chapter 57, verse 14. We're going to go get a little bit. This is the idea of one who has fallen away and who comes back. There's a return for the one who has fallen away and who comes back. There was back then, there is today. You know, we think about back then and we think that God was this God that, you know, if somebody made a mistake, that God struck them down and destroyed them. Because we read instances where this occurs, but that's not the way God is. God receives those back who repent. Did he receive back Manasseh after Manasseh repented? Yeah. He was taken in chains to Babylon. He was, or Assyria. He was taken to Babylon, even though the Assyrians had control at the time. He was taken to Babylon, and while he was there, he repented. God received him back. He says, "I'm gonna restore him," because he was repentant in his backsliding. In verse 14, it says, "And one shall say, heap it up, prepare the way." The idea of taking it out of the road and heaping it up on the side. Heap it up, prepare the way, take the stumbling block out of the way of my people. For thus says the high and lofty one. Who's that? High and lofty one. God. Yeah. Who inhabits eternity. So that kind of narrows it down, doesn't it? God's the only one that inhabits eternity. He is eternal, the only one. Who inhabits eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with him who has a contrite and humble spirit. Who's that? One who comes back, right? The penitent heart. One who has fallen away and one who returns. Could people fall away even in the time of Moses? Certainly so. Absolutely. But when they come back, who dwells with them? God. All right? Who dwells with him who has a contrite and humble spirit, to revive the spirit of the humble and to revive the heart of the contrite ones. For I will not contend forever, nor will I always be angry, for the spirit would fail before me. We know this is a fact because God could not continually be angry, and he was not continually angry, right? He sent the people of Judah away into captivity, but then what did he do? He brought them out. And what did he do with them after he brought them out? He sent them back to Judah and Jerusalem to do what? To rebuild their own city, to rebuild the holy city. Why did that holy city need to be rebuilt? Christ had to come from Jerusalem. He had to worship in the temple. The temple must be rebuilt. He had to worship acceptably. The only way he could worship acceptably is to what? Worship in the temple, to offer sacrifice in the temple. That's the only way it could happen. Okay? If he's going to be faithful in all ways, he had to have worshiped acceptably. That meant that Jerusalem had to be rebuilt. The temple had to be rebuilt. All right? We also know that he was not angry forever because there was a greater purpose behind all of these things that were going to happen. That was the coming of the church. Okay? The coming of the church was so that those who wanted to be at peace with God could be at peace with God. Those who didn't are still able to live their lives however they wish. They will suffer the punishment for it, but now they are able to worship God acceptably if you so desire. If you don't, you can live your life however you wish, with the understanding that there will be consequences for that. So God was not always angry, and we I think a lot of people look at God. We look at God in the Old Testament as being this vengeful, angry God, and the God of the New Testament is this soft, kind, gentle God. But that's not the case. What do we read here? That God's always been gentle. God's always wanted to be peaceable with his people. but they wouldn't allow him to be so. He had to play the old good cop, bad cop routine. And when the people would do as he told them to do, he was gentle with them. He was kind with them. He appealed to them. But when they were disobedient, he had to lay down the law, and that's exactly what happened. But the whole point was that his anger would not dwell with them continually. He would let up, and when he let up, he allowed them to go back home, and he allowed them to rebuild the city. He allowed them to rebuild the temple, and he allowed them to continue in that until the point where that was no longer necessary, and then he allowed that to be destroyed. And the whole point was to erase what was left of that former faith, that former law, so that the new law could reign eternally. Supreme. You can't have two laws, right? That would be, inconsistent. All right. So he says, "Nor will I always be angry." I don't want to be. I will not contend forever. God wants to be peaceable with us. He wants us to be friends in the way that Abraham was his friend. All right. So anyway, in verse 18, "I have seen his ways and I will heal him," talking about the one who falls away, one who backslides. "I have seen his ways and I will heal him, and I will also lead him. I will restore comforts to him and to his mourners." All right, so here it talks about, the one who falls away, if he comes back with a contrite heart, God will dwell with him and dwell peaceably with him. God forgets that error. He forgets that sin, and he wipes the slate clean. And he allows us to dwell with him. All right. Let's see. 58. I don't really want to go into 58. There wasn't as much in there that I really wanted to talk about. Let's go to chapter 59. I couldn't find anything in there. It was talking about some of the ways in which people appeal to God through the acts of the flesh. So most especially fasting. Not really as applicable to us. So let's go to 59. "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened." That idea here is that God's power is not lessened, right? It says his hand is not shortened. God has long reach, and he has a heavy hand, and he can do anything that he wants to do. There's nothing he is unable to accomplish. "The Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, nor is here heavy that it cannot hear." So what does that tell us about God? He's always there. Okay. 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 He wants us to rely on him. He can hear us when we err. He listens for us, doesn't he? Yeah. He listens for us. One of the ways I look at this is, that there were those who went into captivity thinking there was nothing that could be done. This was it. They had no idea that they were going to get to go back home. They thought that this was the end, that they had been wiped away. Much like their neighbors to the north. Remember, the Assyrians came in and carried away the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, and they never returned. So they're thinking the same thing. Here we are, we're gone. This is it. It was a good run, but now we're done for. There's nothing that can be done. But God says, what? My arm hasn't been shortened. I took you into Babylon. I'm going to bring you back out again. Not now, but after how many years was it? No, 70 years. After 70 years, I'm going to bring you back out again. And guess what? 70 years later, then God allowed the nation of Judah to go back home. My arm's not shortened. My power is not lessened even one bit. Nor can my ear not hear you. So he allowed he heard the cries of the people. He heard their complaints, and he allowed them to go back home. It just talks about the idea of the omniscience of God, that God hears all, and that God is all powerful. He's omnipotent as well. But the reason this is happening is verse 2. It says, "But your iniquities have separated you from your God." Not because God has just decided he doesn't want anything to do with you anymore. It's because your sin has come up as an affront before him, and that's what separated you. That's kind of the point to us today, right? What separates us from God? Sin. Yeah. That's the only thing that separates us. God doesn't want that to happen. But sin separates us from God. When we sin, we have rejected him as our ruler. And it is not until we reject sin that God can once again, we cannot serve God and mammon, right? The old saying. You cannot serve God and mammon. You can't serve two masters. So as long as you're in sin, you have rejected God as your ruler. When you finally reject that sin, God is more than happy to come back in and take control, but not until you get rid of what's keeping him out in the first place. Okay? That's something that God has put into place. I'm not going to work in your life if you've rejected me, much in the same way as the Israelites. You've rejected me. How can I reign over you if you've gone after another god? Okay? This is what's occurred. But here it tells us, this is as applicable today as it was back then. Our iniquities have separated us from our God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he will not hear. So when we are in error, does God listen to us? God is listening. God will listen for repentance, but nothing else. Nothing else. God is waiting for us to repent. God is waiting for us to come back. God is waiting for us to give up the sin, and then he'll hear our prayer again. Okay. And look how he describes this. For your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies. Your tongue has muttered perversity. No one calls for justice, nor does any plead for truth. They trust in empty words, and they speak lies. They conceive evil and bring forth iniquity. They hatch viper's eggs and weave the spider's web. He who eats of their eggs dies, and from that which is crushed a viper breaks out. Their webs will not become garments, nor will they cover themselves with their works. Their works are works of iniquity. Iniquity, sin. The words are the same. Okay? They're synonyms. The act of violence is in their hands. Their feet run to evil. If you remember in the book of Proverbs, it talks about there are things that God hates. There are things that God hates. You look at these. These are things that God hates. Violence, feet that run to evil, hands that shed innocent blood. These are things that God, it tells us very specifically that God hates these things. Why? Because they separate people from him. That's why. These things separate God's people from him. And this is what they're engaging in. This is what they've involved themselves in. Okay? In verse 8, the way of peace they have not known, and there is no justice in their ways. Who's he speaking of here? Who is this? Those who are in sin. That's who he's speaking of here. Those who are in sin. Those who have rejected God and instead found another path. Who have maybe embraced, we've been speaking of the idea of idolatry. If you remember the idolatry back then, the idols, the gods that they worshiped were not kind gods. They were harsh gods. They were vengeful gods. And the commandments of those gods involved being vengeful and being angry and being bitter and being destructive. These are the gods that told them to pass their children through the fire. These were the gods that told them to kill the priests of the Israelites. These were the gods that did all of these horrible things. They encouraged them to do. They encouraged them to kill their friends and neighbors and encouraged them to do these horrible acts of violence. These were the gods that they were worshiping instead of Jehovah, who wanted them to deal kindly with one another, as was told to them in the law. You deal kindly with your brother. Not these gods. These gods were gods of vengeance. If one harms you, you harm him back. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Probably it was likely they were involving themselves with the gods of the nations that surrounded, which means we have no idea how long ago were those things created. Hundreds of years ago, 1,000 year ago. Well, yeah, and that's my point. They didn't even have the history behind these things. They were just blindly obeying them. They were grabbing hold of these gods of the nations that surrounded them, and you don't know who created it. You don't know what the purpose was behind it. All you did was it appealed to them. It appealed to their eye. They saw it. They thought it was good to worship, so they worshiped the false god, which meant that to worship the god meant that you obeyed the commandments of that god, and the commandments of that god were evil. They were evil. There's nothing good behind it. So It was a bad thing. And it encouraged them to do these very things, shedding innocent blood and doing evil works. If you saw something that you want, you took it. If it meant lying, if it meant perverting justice, that's what you did. It was about getting what you wanted. It was not about kindliness and love and generosity and being decent. That's not what these gods were about. Okay? So, many of these gods were the same as God. Don't worship any other gods. So you had to reject Jehovah in order to worship this God. All right. So, anyway, this is what's happening in regards to the sin of the people. They had given themselves over to this error and were engaging in it fully and openly without any shame. There was no embarrassment anymore. Okay. All right. I want to go to chapter 60. I want to go to chapter 60. Because this is talking about the relationship with God and the nations, the Gentiles, and what's going to happen. In chapter 16, verse 1, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and deep darkness the people. But the Lord will arise over you, and His glory will be seen upon you. The Gentiles shall come to your light." I wonder if you think that this might be one of the reasons that the people were rejected some of the words of Isaiah, because they believed that they were special. And they were. I mean, we're not trying to get anything away from that. They were special. But the point was they had a purpose to play. They weren't simply special because they were. They were special because they had a specific role in God's plan. But unfortunately, they had taken this to mean that they were superior. And see, that's the problem. The only reason that they were special was because God made them special, not because of anything that they were inherently. Not because of their background or anything like that. They were special because God made them special. Because God had given them promise to their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. Okay? And the promise with them, they were simply recipients of a promise that they had played no part in receiving. They lucked into what they were. Have you ever thought that being a member of the church, you've kind of like won the greatest lottery in the world? Because you think about it. Think about it. If you were raised in any other way, if you were in any other part of the world, if you had any other background or upbringing, it's entirely possible that you would never have even heard of the Lord's church. Entirely possible. If you were raised in rural China, okay, and you were raised, say, 100 years ago in rural China, what do you think the odds are that you would have ever heard the word of the gospel? It's been very difficult. Okay, there are plenty of people who have never heard the gospel. I consider myself to be incredibly fortunate in the fact that I was born into a family that was members of the church. I had a grandfather that was a preacher. I just happened to be, and I consider myself as extremely fortunate. Well, here's what's happening. This is what's happened with the nation of Israel. They were just the recipients of some of the greatest fortune that's ever. They happened to be where they were at that particular time. But the problem is they had taken that to mean that they were superior. So in many cases, when they heard of this idea of the Gentiles will come to God, these hated nations that were surrounding them, that idea was just unthinkable. So in many cases, they rejected this idea that the Gentiles would ever be able to come to God. That's just unthinkable. That can't happen. We're the superior ones. These unwashed Gentiles have no part. But here he says, verse 3, "The Gentiles shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see, they all gather together, they come to you." This is in direct reference to what's going to happen after the gospel is preached. Entire nations are going to come to God. They're going to become Christian nations. They're going to reject paganism. They're going to reject these multiple gods, and they're going to come to Christ. Now, eventually it's going to happen. They're going to pervert the gospel, and they're going to go into a form of Christianity that God doesn't recognize. But Christianity will come to the nations that had never known it before. There's going to be a covenant relationship with nations that had never known God before, had rejected Him in the past. Said, "They all gather together, they come to you. Your son shall come from afar, and your daughter shall be nursed at your side, and then you shall see and become radiant. Your heart shall swell with joy because the abundance of the sea shall be turned to you. The wealth of the Gentiles shall come to you. That idea here is not necessarily physical wealth. It's mainly, you're talking about the idea of being, what was the wealth of a man back in this point in time? Children, right? The numerous family members. That's what a man constituted as wealth. If he had a lot of sons and daughters, he was a wealthy man. Even if he didn't have a lot of physical goods, the fact that he had numerous family meant that he was a wealthy person. Well, here it says, God's children are going to be multiplied. You know, as he said, the Jews were going to be like the sands of the sea. The Christians are going to outnumber those even more dramatically. So he's going to be wealthy by sheer number of those, that family that God is going to bring to himself. The idea of wealth. But anyway, he goes all the way through he continues on talking about how beautiful it's going to be when all of these nations that had once been separated from him because of the restriction on that relationship and that covenant has been released. That covenant's done away with. Where only these people were, now it's anyone is welcome. Everyone is allowed to come to him and be a part of that covenant. Okay? And he continues on, and he goes on, and he goes on, and he goes on, and he talks about not only the people that are going to come to him, but what's going to happen when those people come to him. And go to verse 14. It says, going a little bit further, he says, all those who despised you shall fall prostrate at the soles of your feet, and they shall call you the city of the Lord. And he's talking about Jerusalem, Zion of the Holy One of Israel, whereas you have been forsaken and hated. That's what happens right after the people are taken away. It's forsaken. Remember how many people were left behind when Nebuchadnezzar came back and took them away? It says there were vine dressers and husbandry. Okay, so animals and plants were the only thing left, and people who would tend to those. It was abandoned. Now it's going to be, once again, brought to a city of prominence because the church is going to issue out of that. The gospel is going to come out of the city of Jerusalem, the Zion of the Holy One of Israel. So that no one went through you, I will make you an eternal excellence, a joy of many generations. You shall drink the milk of the Gentiles and milk the breast of kings. You shall know that I, the Lord, am your Savior, and your Redeemer, the mighty one of Jacob. All right, now, we've got to be careful because there are those who will say that this is kind of a proof positive that Jerusalem is going to be restored in the sense that it once was, that it is still an important city in God's eyes, all of this, but we know that that's not the case, is it? That's not the case. You look at Jerusalem today, and there's nothing really to recommend it other than its value as a historic city. That's it. What's happening in Jerusalem? Is the church still in Jerusalem? There is a church in Jerusalem. There's a congregation in Jerusalem, certainly. But is that it? Isn't that it? What else is there? There's the city in of itself really has no prominence anymore because the church is what? It's Catholic. The church is Catholic. It's universal. It's all over the world. It's wherever we end up going, that's where the church is going to be. The idea of Catholic means just simply universal. It's not bound into one city, as the worship of God was before. The church is all over the world. Okay? So the city of Jerusalem has no longer any real precedence. It has no longer really any prominence. But it was important in that was where the church, that was where the gospel was first preached, and the church issued forth out of Jerusalem. All right? We're going to stop there. We will probably finish up next week. Yes, sir. Yes, we did. It had been. They had been trying to do that for a number of years. I personally have no real preference one way or the other, mainly because of my understanding of the Bible. But I know that the nation of Israel, I say nation of this country of Israel, would love to have its capital city in Jerusalem, but because of the uproar that would occur, they're going to leave it in Tel Aviv. But you've got folks that have been wanting to move our embassy into Jerusalem for many, many years. They finally did it. They'd voted on it a long time ago, but nobody wanted to do it because of an uproar. Guess what? There's an uproar because of it. I think there's a lot of much ado about nothing. You know,